Mayhem in modern colloquial speech tends to be more associated with scenes of chaos or bedlam, but these connotations actually gloss over a far more sinister reality. More than just a simple act of inciting havoc, mayhem carries with it the underlying intention of not only terror, but suppression. You see, mayhem is not just another casual word within the English lexicon. It is a legal term, which carries with it the weight of felony should someone be convicted of it. And though it may sound akin to inciting riot or disorder based on our modern usage of the word, the legal definition actually has a lot more in common with murder and mutilation than any kind of rowdy behavior. Let's take a closer look. Legally speaking, mayhem involves the willful disabling, disfigurement, or mutilation of another person, often with the intent of incapacitating them or hindering their ability to fight back, though sometimes it is applied to cases where the person was simply permanently disfigured. Many places have laws surrounding the fundamental concept of mayhem, even if the terminology differs, or the concept is enveloped within another crime, such as statutes involving assault, battery, and negligence. While mayhem may not have appeared as we know it until the 1400s, its legal precedent as a response to an injury that proves to be non-fatal is essentially ancient, dating as far back as the 12 Tables, Rome's earliest written legislation, circa 451 to 450 BCE, where you can find laws referencing crimes and corresponding punishments, such as, if anyone has broken another's limb, there shall be retaliation in kind unless he compounds for compensation with him. And if a person breaks a bone of a free man, either with hand or by club, he shall undergo a penalty of 300 asses or of 150 asses if of a slave. Comparing this to a more modern interpretation, the California Penal Code Section 203 defines mayhem as follows. Every person who unlawfully and maliciously deprives a human being of a member of his body, or disables or disfigures or renders it useless, or cuts or disables the tongue or puts out an eye or slits the nose, ear, or lip, is guilty of mayhem. Though even this definition can seem tame when confronted with an actual instance of mayhem. Many mayhem cases throughout history could be considered small, things like the loss or the breaking of fingers, injuries that certainly can make daily tasks difficult, but are otherwise manageable. For example, an incident from 1303 where a plaintiff brought a case against someone who they claimed had cut off one of their fingers, for which it was ruled that the perpetrator should pay £40 in damages. However, there are instances which end in people suffering from far more harrowing ordeals, with far more debilitating injuries. An example would be a case from 1366 where a man named Thomas was attacked and struck with a dagger on his arm, leaving his nerves, quote, withered and rotted. Another incident from 1348 focuses on a plaintiff who brought forward a case claiming that he had been imprisoned, maimed, wounded, and beaten. The defendant did admit to imprisoning the plaintiff, locking him up as well as binding him and beating him with a rod. However, the defendant claimed that this had only been done as a way to subdue the plaintiff, who came into the village along with cohorts brandishing weapons and beat a man nearly to death, at which point the plaintiff was detained by the defendant, who happened to be the steward of the village. According to the defendant, he himself had been attacked by the plaintiff with a knife, which would have struck had the defendant not gotten a hold of the weapon. So the defendant claims, in the fray the plaintiff reached back to retrieve the knife, but grabbed it by the blade instead of the handle, cutting his own hand with the knife, thus maiming himself and absolving the defendant of any blame or guilt of committing mayhem. But mayhem is not a crime solely relegated to medieval England, and in fact one of the most infamous cases took place in 1978 on a highway in California. Mary Vincent, a 15-year-old looking for a reprieve from a turbulent home life, was hitchhiking along a highway near Berkeley when a blue van pulled up beside her. She was invited in by Lawrence Singleton, an older man who offered to take her as far as Interstate 5. Mary grew concerned as the man drove on past the exit, though he assured her it was an honest mistake and he would turn around and head back. He just needed to pull over for a moment. Mary stepped out of the car for a bit of fresh air, but while she kneeled down to tie an errant shoelace, Singleton came up behind her, striking her over the head with a hammer. He then proceeded to bind her and disabuse her of her bodily autonomy before grabbing a hatchet, and with 2 swings, he severed off her forearms. At this point, after literally disarming her, Singleton had ensured that she had little chance of fighting back or even surviving, as he threw her down into a culvert, leaving Mary to perish. But she didn't. By the next morning, Mary had climbed up and out of the culvert, and after making her way to the road, was rescued by 2 women in a passing car. She was rushed to the hospital, and though the doctors were unable to save her arms, Mary survived, and her vivid description of Singleton helped lead to his speedy arrest. His actions led to a slew of convictions, including kidnapping, attempted murder, and mayhem. However, though his crimes were egregious, the maximum penalty that he was able to receive was a mere 14 1/3 years, of which he only served about 8. California was completely appalled that someone who could commit such a crime would walk free, which led to the state passing the Singleton Bill, enforcing a sentence of 25 years to life for convictions of a new classification of crime they called aggravated mayhem, described in the California Penal Code 205 as a person is guilty of aggravated mayhem when he or she unlawfully, under circumstances manifesting extreme indifference to the physical or psychological well-being of another person, intentionally causes permanent disability or disfigurement of another human being, or deprives a human being of a limb, organ, or a member of his or her body. For purposes of this section, it is not necessary to prove an intent to kill. Aggravated mayhem is a felony, punishable by imprisonment in the state prison for life with the possibility of parole. Even though it may seem odd to have a word that we associate with disorder actually be used in such a gruesome context, looking at the etymology of mayhem may help us to better understand where this connotation came from. Mayhem itself, as of the late 15th century, was used in the context of a violent doing of bodily harm to another person, coming from the Anglo-French word mayhem, a variation of the 14th century word maimen, to disable by wounding, mutilation, to damage, destroy, seriously injure, or to castrate, which later evolved into the familiar English word maim, making maim and mayhem doublets. Maimen is derived from the Old French mahanye, meaning injury, damage, harm, hurt, or wrong. It is the noun form of mahanye, to injure, wound, disarm, cripple, or mutilate. It is thought that these words may be descended from Vulgar Latin, a more colloquial form of Latin that could differ from region to region. The proposed origin here would potentially be manahare, which has been linked to the Italian magagna, meaning flaw, defect, or infirmity. And even though this connection is still uncertain, it is easy to see how the 2 words could be linked and possibly share a common ancestor. The origins of manahare are not known, but it has been suggested that it could have Germanic roots, potentially being derived from the morpheme mate, which also happens to be the source of the Old Norse word metha, meaning to hurt. It is also possible that manahare may be descended from the Proto-Indo-European root me, meaning to cut. And we see this strong connection between mayhem and maim appear in a medieval legal compendium from the late 12th century, written by Ranulpho de Glanvilla, the Chief Justiciar of England during the reign of Henry II. In the treatise on the laws and customs of the Kingdom of England, Glanville references the condition of mahamiam, an ancestor to our word mayhem. However, in this context, its meaning more closely resembles that of maim, speaking of a condition of a person rather than an act of violence. You see, at the time, a common method of trial and punishment for an offense that one man carried out against another would be an ordeal by combat, such as a duel, with the logic being that whoever claimed victory was correct in the eyes of God. Yet people could argue that they were unfit for this kind of trial, either by being too young, too old, or physically unable to participate, aka mahamiam. Generally, pleading mahamiam indicated something along the lines of a broken bone and or fracturing, weakening, or abrasion, particularly of a person's head. And instead of an ordeal by combat, it was suggested that the offender undergo a trial by ordeal, via a hot iron for a free man, or by water if he is a peasant. It wasn't until the 13th century that we see the beginnings of the shift towards mayhem being used in the sense of an act of violence inflicted on someone else. It comes to us from Henry de Bracton, a medieval English jurist and author of the 1235 treatise on the laws and customs of England, but it is in a separate work attributed to him, Bracton's Notebook, where we find this shift. In the entry, a man named Simonem assaults another, Vulturus, for previous offenses committed by Vulturus. The latter sustained a head wound, rendering him maimed, and this act of maiming was recognized as mayhem. So given the history of mayhem and its close relation to the word maim, the question now becomes, how did it evolve from such a bloody past to be used in its modern sense of disorder? It seems that sometime around the 19th century, mayhem underwent a semantic shift. A semantic shift refers to any change in the meaning of a word or words over time, though this can simply mean an addition or loss of meaning, rather than a full overhaul of the definition. This shift can also be referred to as a semantic change, semantic progression, or lexical shift. There are currently 4 main types of semantic shift. One type of shift is narrowing, where the definition of a word becomes more restrictive. An example of this is the word girl. First recorded in the mid-13th century, it was originally indicative of a child of either sex, but has since come to be used specifically to reference a female child. The second type is broadening, which describes the expansion of a word's definition. We see this happen in the case of mayhem, as its definition widens from just an acute act of violence to also encompass violence in general, allowing it to equate with riots, wars, and massacres as well, rather than just a singular act of mutilation as it was previously used. Third, we have pejoration, or the depreciation of a word's meaning. This is where a word takes on more negative connotations over time, and this is another kind of shift that we see come into play with our word mayhem, as its earlier form was once used to indicate that a person was maimed before it evolved to describe a truly brutal and personal attack, which resulted in a person being maimed. Lastly, there is amelioration, a shift which actually elevates the meaning of a word to something with more positive connotations, or at least less negative ones. Yet again, we can see this kind of shift take place with mayhem later on, where we see it transform from that act of violence to simple chaos. It still has that feeling of aggression, but that feeling is more nebulous. It can be as benevolent as panic. It is difficult to know specifically when or how these shifts took place. However, we do have references from the 1800s which show mayhem being utilized as a broader term to describe violence in general, as opposed to a specific targeted attack. Then, in the 20th century, we see the usage evolve to be more in line with our modern definitions of chaos or havoc, each of which has also evolved from darker and more acute origins. But mayhem's double life is what makes it especially interesting, because although time and common speech have seemingly ripped out its teeth, its true origins are not only remembered, but are still relevant today. Thank you so much for being here through the end if you were. Please leave a like if you learned something. Also, feel free to leave a comment if there are any other words you would like to see covered in the future.